Hi, this video is looking at writing a short story. This is for the narrative writing exam for the EDUCAS GCSE Language. It's a 45-minute exam. Can be used for any exam board, but this one is looking at the EDUCAS GCSE English Language. I'm going to start with in a minute how to plan the short story. This video is more looking at how to get a grade 4 to grade 6. If you want to look at how to get a grade 9, have a look at my other videos on my YouTube page. So to get a C or a grade 4, we're looking for around 18 to 20 out of 40. And the national reset average is only around 10 to 14 out of 40. So I think the creative writing one, if you're struggling, is probably going to be the easiest one to gain more marks. So a few tips then. I would always put my story in the past. One thing the examiner says is that students struggle with tenses. So if you do it all in the past tense, it should help you. Stories to avoid when you're doing your stories. You will get 4 or 5 titles, however, the titles are so vague that you can really talk about anything. So stories to avoid, I would say, fairy tales, wizards, going back in time, teenage pregnancy, drug abuse, murder or blood, dream endings. The reason I put them in is that either they're too ambitious, yeah, so we've only got 45 minutes, we've only got a couple of pages, can't really talk about wizards, fairy tales and time travel, and the other thing is we don't want to do something too serious. Teacher tip, try to set your story over a short period of time, maybe even a few minutes. Do not set it over days, weeks, months or years. So remember, even though it's a short story, we're not doing an autobiography, we're not doing a story of someone's life, we're just doing a moment, a humorous moment of someone's life. So in the November exam, these are the things the examiners pointed out. They said that a lot of the stories were too brief. They said there was no evidence of planning for a lot of students. They said there were struggles with basic accuracies, that's spelling, punctuation and grammar and tenses. And they gave a bit of advice. They said that realistic stories will get people a higher grade. So from what we're going to do now and what I'm telling my students we're going to do from now on, the story is going to take place in only one setting, so one location. At maximum, we're going to have 2 characters. We don't want loads of characters. We've only got 45 minutes. We're going to sell it over a very short period of time. A clear ending. So what I mean by that is a lot of students, because they haven't really paid attention to the clock, they almost just finish they will build up the tension, they'll build up the story, and then they'll do a short little ending. That will be maybe 1 line. So we want to really make sure we work on the stories and the endings. We're going to write in the past tense. I would say a really good tip would be to do something that's really happened to you. The examiner says we should be doing realistic stories, so do something that's really happened in your life. Show, not tell, which I'll talk about later. We're looking at 2 to 3 pages, and we need a definite beginning, middle and end. What we're also going to do is we're going to plan for 5 minutes of our 45-minute in the exam. This is crucial. We're going to make the story realistic, and we're going to use something from our personal experience. So if we've got a 2-word word count, that's one thing that students struggle with. A lot of the time it's not because they're not creative enough, it's probably because it's the last question in the exam, because remember, you do the paper 1 reading exam at the same time before the short story, so word count is a problem. The word count is 450 to 600 words, average writing is 2.5 to 3 pages. It's important to note the examiner will not spend time counting the words, but to be honest it's pretty obvious what's too short and what's too long. So I would say anything under 2 pages, or at least 1.5 pages, you're going to struggle to get a good score. So if we look at this is a story that a student did, and even though it's on the computer, that would only be about 1 page of writing. So that is a typical thing that a student will do and a typical thing the examiner will mark. And because of the 2-word word count, the examiner has said, these are the examiner comments, a thin, brief narrative, an uncomfortable ending, limited plot. Thin, brief and limited all basically mean the same thing. It's not enough, too short. And then it's got 6 out of 40, which would be about a grade 1 or a grade 2. How are you going to increase your word count? You're going to plan the story beforehand. You're going to practice timed writing, so you're going to practice doing exams where you're doing it under timed conditions. And maybe, I've put this in a question mark, maybe you could think about, this would be just your decision or your teacher's decision with you, maybe start the paper 1 exam with a short story. So like I said before you do your short story normally, you have 5 reading questions. The exam is an hour and 45 minutes. The reading exam is meant to take an hour and the short story is meant to take 45 minutes. However, no one says you can't switch the order, so maybe think about doing the short story first. So here's a typical exam. You will get 3 or 4 prompts. So for example, the escape, a time I got lost, moonlight madness, and you'll probably get one where it says start or end with something. So it might say start a story with I didn't know I had the courage to do this, or you could end the story with and that was my best birthday ever, or something like that. Story structure. So beginning, middle and end, pretty simply. So the beginning is going to be introduce the characters, your number 2 is going to introduce attention, and number 3 resolve that tension. So for example, if we were talking about a James Bond film, we'd introduce James Bond, then number 2 we introduce someone who's trying to take over the world like a baddie, and number 3 is James Bond kills the baddie and we're back to normal. So if we look at example, let's look at, let's say one of the story prompts I've been given is the escape. I'm going to pick the escape. I'm going to do it about a tiger. Okay, again, this isn't a realistic one, but so I wouldn't do this in the exam, but I just want to show you a good plan. So I'll show you a good plan example. A plan is crucial because if you don't know what the end of your story is before you begin writing, you're going to ramble on and it's going to be pretty obvious that it's a pretty unstructured. So a good plan example would be, a zookeeper enters his enclosure and notices all is quiet. Then he sees a hole in the fence, but then he panics but finds the tiger asleep on a bench outside. So really simple little story, beginning, middle and end. So beginning would be zookeeper enters enclosure and notices all is quiet. Middle is he sees a hole in the fence, and the ending is panics but finds the tiger asleep on a bench outside. So it's only a little 5-minute moment in someone's life. It's not the whole story of the zookeeper or the tiger's life. Okay, planning is crucial. If I didn't have these 3 bullet points I just looked at, I wouldn't know where my piece of writing is going. If I don't know where it's going, 90%, 99% of the time, the story will be muddled and not make sense to you or the examiner. So bad planning, let's look at a bad plan example. And this little image basically is meant to signify what would happen to you if you don't plan well. So basically a bank robber going in and the shutters and the doors closing behind him and he's stuck. So I'll give you a bad plan example. A zookeeper is arguing with wife. He eats his breakfast in a huff, gets to work and the cage empty. The tiger's escaped and attacks a child. A SWAT team arrive. The tiger is captured but the child dies. The zookeeper goes to the funeral and kills himself over the guilt. Okay, this might make a good novel, but if you try to write this in 45 minutes, it would be an absolute disaster. We don't want lots and lots of stuff happening, different locations. Simple plot, simple problem, one location, a couple of characters. So again, beginning, middle and end. Okay, I'm just going to show you an example of, probably about a grade 6 story about school. So remember we said we want to do stuff about realism and school, and obviously all you guys can talk about something that happened at school. It doesn't have to be the most amazing thing, it can just be an incident. So let's read one through. How could I have been so stupid? If I hadn't listened to Chloe, if I hadn't missed the lesson, then I wouldn't be sitting here with this dread running through my body. I stared at the paper until I felt dizzy. Sweating, I turned it over in my hand before closing it and discarding it into the small wooden exam desk. I placed my head in my hands and thought about the terrible mistake I had made. The exam question before me glared at me like a jealous boyfriend. It was the only question I couldn't answer because it was a question about the one topic I haven't covered. I looked across the exam hall at Chloe. Her face was planted on the desk and she had scrunched her exam paper into a tiny ball. As she raised her head and made watery eye contact with me, I heard her words from that day echoing in my mind. Come on, Chloe's voice pressured me just this once. Chloe had been my best friend since year 7. We did everything together, revision, dating and growing up. We were always geeky, hard-working students, and the thought of missing a lesson made my stomach churn. However, I knew that Chloe just wanted to do something crazy and to shock other people in our year group who thought we weren't capable of bunking. I didn't want to miss the lesson or get into trouble when we were found out, but I wanted to do something risky too. We only live once, right? We waited until the rest of the class had left the previous lesson and then we sauntered down the corridor, failing to pull off the cool look we were aiming for. We used a flock of children to creep into the toilets. We were doing it, there was no going back now. Feeling a sense of triumph, the first 10 minutes were exciting. We actually had the courage to do something naughty. However, as the thrill wore off, we became depressed by the toilet stench. We were trapped and restricted as the wet clumps of tissue paper that were stuck on the ceiling. Bored, Chloe started to pick up the old pink paint that covered the crumbling stone walls. Why had we thought this would be fun? As we felt the excitement fade, we thought about the trouble we'd be in when we were caught. My heart thumped as I thought about walking into the classroom. What I didn't think about that day was the regret I was going to feel when I opened my exam paper. The question I was faced with now was on the topic that the class covered that lesson, the topic I knew zero about, the topic that would prevent me from passing this exam. I never knew that the lesson I spent in the toilet would come back to haunt me. As the clock's tick filled the exam hall, one thought scrambled my brain. How could I have been so stupid? Okay, so let's look at our story example again. So the exam title was What About a Time I Regretted the Decision. Okay. Was it set in one place? Yeah. Well, the toilet, so basically the school. Do you think it meets the word count? Yeah, it did. It was 517, so it's probably a little bit on the short side, but just about made the word count. Does it have one or two characters? Yeah, it has one main character, and we hear a little bit about a friend. Was it believable? I think it definitely was believable. We can definitely imagine this happening at school. What did you think of it? I would say it's a nice, simple story. We get a nice feel of the character. We think basically she's got a good student. She just wanted to do something naughty. You probably all would have known someone like this at your school. So if we look at the beginning, middle and end, the beginning is the friends persuaded to miss the lesson. Number 2, the spend the lesson in toilets, that's the middle. And the ending is the topic they missed in the exam. They regret missing the exam. They're in the exam hall and they're a bit ashamed of missing the lesson. However, even though that is beginning, middle and end, this student did something quite interesting where they actually started the story at the end, didn't they? So they started the most interesting part about the exam hall. So we actually start with the exam and then we sort of go back in time to friends persuade me to miss the lesson, and then we finish with spend the lesson in the toilet. So that's maybe something you can think about. You can jiggle around with the beginning, middle and end. So the examiner says, I put this in quotes because the examiners have said that realistic stories will get you a higher grade. Okay, so when you do your plans for your story, and again, I would say try and do something about your school. If not, do something that's happened to you recently. So I want you to fulfill this criteria when you do your plans. Make sure something's taken from your own life, but a humorous little thing, not a massive story, nothing that is sensitive, nothing that is sad, nothing that is inappropriate. Make it realistic, a maximum 2 characters, set it over a few minutes. So for example, that school one a minute ago was probably only set over 3 or 4 minutes. One location, clear beginning, middle and end, and make sure you can write at least 2 pages about it. So think about what kind of student were you at school. Were you this kind of student? Were you this kind of student? Were you this kind of student? So think about what kind of student you were when you were at school. Okay, and see if you can pause the video, a couple of minutes, try to think of a funny or memorable moment at school that you could fulfill all the criteria that we've already talked about. So feel free to pause the video. So the exam title for that one we looked at was Write About a Time I Regretted a Decision. And again, when you've decided on a bit of an activity, think to yourself, is it fun to write? Is it going to surprise the examiner? What can you do in 2.5 pages? So maybe if you try to fulfill those 3 things as well, that's going to get you high marks as well. So remember, your plot should be small and interesting. The plot in the story just looked, it was just basically about a girl who bunked a lesson and then regretted it because it was in her exam. So enough, we don't want massive stories. We don't want anything to do with you being expelled and you tell us all about your life at home. Just something small and interesting that's happened. So let's look at writing the opening line and the opening paragraph. So writing a memorable opening line is really, really important. Okay. 98% of books, this is what publishers have told us, 98% of books are sold on the strength of the first 2 sentences. This is basically because people go in there, they flick through the book, they look at the first page, and if they like to look at the first couple of sentences, they will buy the book. So we're going to make really an opening sentence that really grabs the reader's attention, and really grabs the examiner's attention. If you come up with a really boring sentence at the start, the examiner will straight away think, oh, this is going to be a boring story. So your opening line, we want it to be really good to reflect the rest of your story. And there's ways that we can do this. Okay, so what I want you to do is look at these lines. If you can do it, pause the video and zoom in, that's fine. But if not, these are basically 8 lines here. Okay, so these are 8 real lines from students, and I'll say the bottom one. Let's look at the bottom one. It was nearing that time again, that dreaded time, my young cousin's birthday party. So that story got 8 out of 40, and the first line sort of reflects it. First of all, there's a couple of spelling and grammar mistakes. For example, young shouldn't have a capital, but it is just quite boring as well. And if we look at the top couple, Number one, I didn't know if I had the courage to do this. So really a sort of simple statement, but quite one that stands out. One advice I'd probably give you is I would probably use a rhetorical question. So if you look at number two, how could I have been so stupid? It grabs it's almost like you're talking directly to the reader, grabbing the reader's attention, and the reader wants to find out what's happened. Okay, so to grab the reader's attention, there's lots of methods you can do. You could do dialogue, people speaking. Feel free to pause any of these. You could do a statement. You could do action. You could do a description of people, description of time, or like the one I've talked about, rhetorical question, which is probably my favourite one. So there you go. If you want to pause the video, why don't you now pause the video and see if you can write an opening sentence for your story, and maybe trying to do one for all of these. So try and do one that's dialogue, try to do a statement, try to do a rhetorical question example, and then after that go through them and then pick your favourite one. Okay, writing a memorable opening paragraph. The great first paragraph should really be, it's the same sort of advice as the first line. So it needs to hook the reader, it needs to get the reader thinking, try and be clever or funny, go straight into the action. We don't want you waffling about what a person is wearing, what the room is like. A lot of students do this. They think a story is all about describing something. So for example, instead of going straight into the action and grabbing my attention, I might get 2 or 3 lines describing what someone's wearing, or what someone's hat's like, or what the weather is like. We've only got 45 minutes, we've only got a couple of pages, let's get straight into the action. Okay, so here's the first paragraph again from that story. How could I have been so stupid? So again, I'm not going to read it again. You read it, pause the video and read the first paragraph again. Okay, and then what my students do is what they did. I got them to highlight language techniques. So for example, rhetorical question, sensory language, and show not tell. So for example, I wanted them to highlight any good examples of show don't tell. So remember, but basically what show don't tell means is, we don't want any sentences where you are saying the man was happy, the man was sad. That is telling me, show me the man was happy. So say the man smiled, for example. Okay, so this is the techniques. So we've got a rhetorical question to start. We've got hyperbole, exaggeration. We've got a really good simile here, like a jealous boyfriend. It's really important, if you're going to use a simile, don't use loads and loads. I would say all of these techniques, rhetorical question, simile, for example, simile, only use one simile. You've only got 45 minutes. We don't want 2 pages that have got 8 similes in. And also, pick a simile that is mature. You're not going to get a good mark if you were saying something was cold and you said as cold as ice. If you said he eats like a pig. Try and use interesting, mature simile. So this one here, like the exam question, glared at me like a jealous boyfriend. It's really immature, really intelligent. Scrunch, onomatopoeia. So straight away I'm showing the examiner that I can show off a little bit. I can use these techniques to impress the reader and get the reader involved. Okay, sensory language. So in sensory language, we want to use that in the first paragraph quite a lot, because we want to feel like we want the reader to be able to imagine they are in. They can hear what the characters are hearing. They can see what the characters are hearing. They can taste what the characters are tasting. So sight, we could have stared at the paper, glared at me. Touch, we know what scrunch feels like, don't we? And then sound. So we've got quite a lot of sensory language there to get the reader really involved. And finally, show don't tell. So stared at the paper tells the reader. I'm not going to say I was unhappy when I looked at the paper. Stared at the paper shows me she's not happy, she doesn't know what to do. Sweating, she shows me she's nervous or stressed. Discarding onto the small desk shows she's given up on the exam. Place my head in my hands shows she's upset. Her face was planted on the desk shows the friend's character is the same as the main character's feelings. She scrunched her exam paper up so she's given up. And watery eye contact shows me she's upset or crying. So instead of telling me this, this writer in the first paragraph is really cleverly shown me how the character and the character's friend's feeling, and that's definitely what you should try to do in your big story. Okay, and there it all is in one go. The techniques, the sensory language, and the show don't tell in a really, it's only about a 10-sentence paragraph, the opening paragraph. However, it's really good and uses all those techniques to feel like the reader is involved. So again, write your opening paragraph, straight into the action, show don't tell, one location, and do it in your past tense. Okay, and this is again a bit more in detail about show don't tell. Don't write sentences like the man was tired, the man was happy, the man was angry. So instead of the man was tired, you could have the man yawned as he looked at his watch. Instead of the man was happy, you could have the man smiled. And instead of the man was angry, you could say the blood rushed to the man's face as he shouted loudly. Okay, so opening paragraph. Okay, we've talked about creating an opening line. I would use a rhetorical question. What the hell was I thinking? Or something suitable. Get to reader involved straight away. Okay, dialogue. Okay, remember we want people speaking. Okay, so if you're not too sure how to punctuate dialogue, I've got a video on here, but or just look on the internet, look for the punctuation skills. But I don't want you to do what is on the next slide. Okay, so we don't want that. It's not a script. I would say if you're doing 2.5 pages, I would have someone speaking at just once or twice at the most. We don't want it like this. We want a good story, but we don't want a play where people are speaking back and forth. So just maybe use dialogue once or twice. Okay, writing a memorable ending. A lot of students write good stories, but because they don't do very well with looking at the time, they've only got 45 minutes. They're not particularly great at watching or creating a very good ending. Okay, remember, we don't want to do a dream ending because the examiner will just think that is not particularly good at all. So we want to do a really good memorable ending. So the ending is the final impression the reader has of your writing. Your ending should be included in your plan, so you know what your ending is before you start writing. Think about your tone, happy, sad, funny. So what I mean by this is, if your character has been funny all the way through, let's have a funny ending. If the character's been happy all the way through, let's have a happy ending. If the character's been sarcastic all the way through, the ending should reflect that. What we don't want is a funny story and at the end someone dies or something like that, and the tone just sort of feels a bit strange how the tone has changed. So keep the tone all the same, and craft your final sentence carefully. A bit like we're crafting the opening sentences. The last sentence will obviously be the last bit of your writing the examiner will read. So let's leave the writer on let's leave the examiner when they read your final line up blown away by how great it is, and don't say it was a dream. So a way to end your story, the 3 typical ways would be a closed ending, to when all the threads are neatly tied. So for example, James Bond, there's a baddie taking over the world, James Bond kills the baddie, so everything goes back to normal. An open ending, when a story fails to provide satisfying closure and leaves the reader with questions still left. And a twist ending, when a story takes an unexpected turn. So for example, if you're watching a horror film where you think the evil character has died, maybe just before the credits go up, we see the evil character move his hand or something. So it's a little bit of a twist ending. I would say all of those are fine. If it was me, I'd probably do a closed ending, just because there's only 45 minutes and 2 pages. I would almost write my writing circular, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Now, so if you look at the story we looked at in the video already about the school, they begin, how could I have been so stupid? And the last sentence is, blah, 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 one thought scrap in my brain, how could I have been so stupid? So if you look at it, it ends with the same line that it starts with, and it makes the writing circular. So what I mean by this is, we start off in one place, then there's a problem solved, and then we go back to normal. So I would say that's a really good technique. So the opening sentence was what? How could I have been so stupid? And the closing sentence is, how could I have been so stupid? I would say, obviously, if it doesn't fit, you can't do it. But if it fits and you mould your writing into a way that it can fit, I would say that really would impress the examiner. So remember, what we're going to do now with the story, and you're going to do for your revision, only one setting, maximum 2 characters, set over a very short period of time, clear ending, write in the past tense, try to do something that really happened to you, show, don't tell, 2 or 3 pages, and a definite beginning, middle and end. Hopefully follow all these tricks, you'll get a really good grade. Hopefully you'll be a bit more confident with your stories now. Any questions, leave a comment in the comment section.